Ok. Buenas tardes a todos y todas. Espero que estén bien y listos para conectarse con esta interesante charla sobre la eficiencia de medidas de control de perros callejeros, que va a ser dictada por la doctora Lauren Smith. Antes de comenzar, les quería pedir que mantengan sus micrófonos y cámaras apagadas para evitar cualquier distracción y mejorar la transmisión durante la charla. Luego de la charla habrá un espacio para hacer preguntas. Para ello les invito a escribir las preguntas durante o después de la charla en el chat. Y luego al finalizar el doctor Gerardo Acosta las irá leyendo. Y además, también como ya saben, esta charla será traducida simultáneamente. Y para los que aún no han... para los que todavía no saben cómo hacerlo, para acceder a ello deben en la barra de menú que está abajo del Zoom, donde aparece participantes, está el símbolo de chat, después está el símbolo de interpretación. Si hacen clic ahí, sale la opción de poder escuchar en inglés o en español. Y ahí pueden elegir cuál es el que ustedes prefieran para escuchar la presentación. Bueno, finalmente quería también dar las gracias a todas las personas que ayudaron a que esta charla sea posible hoy día. En primer lugar, a Paula Ramírez y Grisel Navarro, que permitieron que la cuenta de Zoom esté disponible para nosotros. Andrea Cayosi, que estará traduciendo. Gerardo Acosta, que moderará la sesión de preguntas y respuestas, y Denis Araya, que nos ayudará a contestar preguntas en el chat. También quería dar las gracias a la Consejería de Colmevet de Ñuble y La Araucanía, a la Comisión Nacional de Bienestar Animal y Tenencia Responsable, a la Municipalidad de Chillán, a la Universidad Austral de Chile y a la Universidad Católica de Temuco. Bueno, y ahora los dejo con Grisel Navarro, quien dará la bienvenida en nombre del auspiciador.
Muy buenas tardes a todos. En nombre propio y de la Universidad Católica de Temuco, les doy la más cordial de la bienvenida a la actividad de hoy. Quisiera ser bastante breve, pero en primer lugar agradecer al Colegio Médico Veterinario por hacer posible este tipo de iniciativas que nos permiten tener acceso a este tipo de información actualizada y de calidad en el ámbito de la medicina veterinaria y todas sus temáticas afines. En segundo lugar, quisiera agradecer a la organización, en especial a la doctora Paula Ramírez y Laura Salazar por la invitación a formar parte de esta charla a través de los recursos informáticos de nuestra casa de estudio, como es el uso de nuestra plataforma Zoom, quien por segunda vez nos acompaña y nos permite conectarnos. La Universidad Católica de Temuco se complace profundamente en apoyar este tipo de iniciativas. Y por último, solo desear que disfruten la charla de hoy y agradecer a Laura Smith por su buena disposición y tiempo. Muchas gracias y le doy la palabra a Laura.
Muchas gracias, Grisel. Ahora las dejo con la doctora Lauren Smith. Lauren, si quieres puedes ir poniendo tus diapositivas por mientras que te presento. Lauren es licenciada en... Disculpen. Un minuto. Ok, disculpen. Lauren es licenciada en Zoología de la Universidad de Glasgow, es magíster también en Biología de Animales Silvestres y doctora de la Universidad de Leeds, donde hoy ejerce como investigadora postdoctoral. Sus intereses de investigación incluyen salud y bienestar animal, y ecología de poblaciones y enfermedades y moderación de sistemas. El día de hoy nos presentará sus resultados de su tesis doctoral. Adelante, Loren.
Thank you. Can you see my slides okay? So thank you very much for having me here. It's my pleasure to present some of my PhD research to you. So first, I'm going to start with a bit of background information. So the global dog population is made up of about 700 million to about 1 billion dogs. And since dogs have been domesticated, they've become very closely associated with us. They take on lots of different roles in their relationship with people. We use them as working dogs, such as guard dogs, and in herding and hunting, as well as guide dogs. We use them in sport as sporting animals, and we also use them as our companions. This global dog population can be split up into different subpopulations depending on their level of restriction and also on their relationship with people. So you can have dogs that are owned, but they're restricted, so they're kept as our pets. You can have dogs that are not owned, but they're restricted in shelter populations. You can have dogs that are owned, but they're not restricted, what we might call free roaming pets. And you can have dogs that are unowned and unrestricted, what we might call stray dogs. And it is those dogs that are unrestricted, including those that are owned and unowned, that are part of what we call the free roaming dog population or the street dog population. And it's estimated that up to about 75% of the global dog population are free roaming. So that means that they are unrestricted, they're free to roam, and they're free to reproduce. They use our resources to sustain themselves. They might be fed directly by people, or they might scavenge on human waste. They can also feed on small mammals and birds and also on our livestock. This free roaming dog population is linked to a number of issues. Firstly, in terms of public health, dogs are responsible for spreading a large number of zoonotic pathogens. They're probably most notable for spreading rabies. They can also cause road traffic accidents, and they can injure people through biting as well. Free roaming dogs are also responsible for the killing of livestock, such as smaller and medium-sized livestock, such as sheep, goats, and donkeys. They can also threaten the conservation of our wildlife through spreading pathogens, through predating on wildlife, hybridizing with them, and also through competition. The free roaming dogs themselves can also experience poorer health and welfare, which is linked to a lack of resources and a higher prevalence of disease. Because of these issues, we carry out dog population management so that we can reduce the size of this free roaming dog population and also improve their health and welfare and mitigate against these risks that this population poses. The main methods used to control dog populations includes the culling of dogs, sheltering dogs, so moving them from the street into the shelter, responsible dog ownership interventions, and the sterilization of dogs through a method called catch, neuter, return, or CNR for short. This is where dogs are caught on the street, they're neutered, and then they're returned back to the location where they were found, with the aim of this method being that there will be fewer free roaming dogs on the street and fewer puppies, like some of these puppies from my fieldwork in Ukraine. So there are lots of different methods of dog population management, but there is therefore a need to assess the effectiveness and the efficiency of each of these methods when we consider the impact that they have on the free-roaming dog population size, their health, and the risks that they have to public health and other animal populations. So this leads me to the aim of my research. I aimed to investigate and to compare the impact of dog population management methods on free-roaming dog population dynamics, health and welfare, in terms of how sustainable, how effective, and how efficient these different methods were. Dog population management often aims to reduce the dog population size, but also to stabilize the population turnover. And to reduce population size, the management methods aim to alter the sources of the free-roaming dog population increase and decrease. So we can imagine the free-roaming dog population as water inside a bathtub. And this population can increase through births, abandonment, and immigration, like turning on the tap. And it can also decrease through deaths, adoption, and emigration. So this is important because each of the different dog population management methods aims to impact the different flows that increase or decrease this dog population. So catch, neuter, return aims to decrease the birth rate. Culling aims to increase the death rate. Sheltering is a special kind of emigration which moves dogs from the stray dog population into the shelter dog population. And responsible dog ownership interventions, they depend on the method that's being used, but they can reduce the amount of abandonment and also encourage adoption of dogs. So as the management methods aim to alter these rates, it's important to understand these processes of dog population dynamics. This includes how much recruitment is occurring in the population through the births, abandonment, and immigration, and also how much removal is occurring in the population through deaths, emigration, and the adoption of dogs. It's also important to understand the attitudes towards the free-roaming dog population so that we can ensure that the management is successful. Free-roaming dogs can be an important part of a community. They can provide companionship for people, and they can also protect people and their livestock. This means that there needs to be support for the management methods and also support for the aims of the management method, such as a reduction in the free-roaming dog population. So it's therefore important that we also measure attitudes towards the different dog population management methods so that we can understand the demand for management and understand how effective different management methods might be. So our research focuses on countries in Europe, in Bulgaria, Italy, and in Ukraine. And I'd just like to mention that we are very concerned and sad about what is happening in Ukraine at the moment. The locations where we have conducted our research and the locations where our collaborators are have been affected by the conflict in Ukraine, and we very much hope that this conflict will end soon. In Europe in general, there is a lack of data on dog ownership practices, dog population dynamics, and attitudes towards free-roaming dog populations, even though there are an abundance of free-roaming dog populations in many countries throughout Europe. We chose these locations because they are culturally and environmentally distinct, and they allowed us to compare the data that we collected between the different countries. We also had collaborators and networks in these countries that allowed us to collect data and allowed us access to historical records in these areas. So this research In this research, we had three main questions that we wanted to answer. We wanted to understand what the attitudes were towards the free-roaming dog populations and how might the ownership practices in that area contribute to the free-roaming dog population. We then wanted to understand the size, the dynamics, and the health status of the dog populations in the focal countries and appreciate how these factors might influence the success of dog population management. We then wanted to understand what different management methods were effective and efficient at reducing the free-roaming dog population size. So to answer these questions, we distributed an online questionnaire survey to determine the ownership practices and attitudes towards free-roaming dogs. We then conducted a mark recapture survey to determine the size, the dynamics, and the health status of dog populations in our focal countries. And then using this information, we developed a systems model to assess the impacts of dog population management on the dog population sizes. So firstly, focusing on the questionnaire survey. As I've mentioned, it's important in order for interventions to be successful, we need to understand if there is support for the management method and for its aims. Different communities can have different attitudes towards free-roaming dogs, and this might be due to the culture, the religion in the area, and also the risks that the free-roaming dogs have in that location. Dog ownership practices can also influence the success of population management. Unrestricted owned dogs and dogs that are abandoned are sources that can increase the free-roaming dog population. So we therefore wanted to understand if owned dogs were allowed to roam, if they were neutered, and if owned dogs were abandoned to the street. So to conduct this research, we used an online survey to distribute our questionnaire in Bulgaria, Italy, and Ukraine. And this questionnaire was available in 5 languages, in English, Bulgarian, Italian, Ukrainian, and Russian. And we made use of Facebook advertising to increase the visibility of our research. This questionnaire was open between March and December in 2019. And we had a huge number of responses. We had over 3,000 responses in Italy, over 5,000 responses in Bulgaria, and incredibly, we had almost 20,000 responses in Ukraine. So some of the key findings. So to answer our question for was there support for a reduction in free-roaming dogs, we found that most respondents in all of the countries answered that they would prefer to see no or fewer free-roaming dogs, and that they would like the population to be managed through methods such as catch, neuter, return, controlling the birth of owned dogs, and by removing dogs and placing them into the shelter. Now looking at ownership practices, we found that more respondents in Italy answered that they had neutered their dog compared to respondents in Ukraine or Bulgaria. And when we asked these respondents, those respondents who did not neuter their dog, why they didn't neuter their dog, most of the respondents answered that they felt that a dog should reproduce at least once in its lifetime. We also found that many more respondents allowed their dog to roam either some or all of the time in Bulgaria, compared to much fewer in Italy and slightly fewer in Ukraine. Respondents were also asked if they had ever relinquished a dog, and if they had relinquished a dog, what did they do with that dog? Interestingly, much higher percentages of respondents in Bulgaria answered that they let their dog free to the street, compared to very few in Italy and Ukraine. The majority of respondents answered that they gave a dog to a friend if they had relinquished a dog. We then tested for statistical associations to understand if there were any associations between demographic factors and ownership practices such as neutering and roaming. And we found that those respondents that were male, if respondents held religious beliefs or owned dogs for practical reasons compared to for companionship or for pleasure, and also respondents that were younger and had no schooling or primary education had a lower probability of answering that they neutered their dog and a higher probability of answering that they allowed their dogs to roam. We asked quite a lot of questions in our questionnaire survey. So if anyone is interested to find out some of the details here, we just recently published this work in PLOS One. It's an open access journal. So if you're interested, please go on and have a read of our research. But the main take-home messages are that there was a preference in all of the 3 studied countries for there to be a reduction in free-roaming dog numbers, and for this to be achieved through sheltering, catch, neuter, return, responsible ownership, rather than through culling. There was therefore support for the management interventions that were currently taking place in these 3 different countries. The statistical associations could allow us to target interventions to influence the behavior of those that are less likely to practice responsible ownership. This could therefore be used to help improve responsible ownership and reduce free-roaming dog numbers. For example, we found evidence for significant associations between gender and the age of respondents on the probability of allowing a dog to roam and the probability of not neutering a dog. Therefore, interventions could be targeted towards men and younger people on responsible ownership practices. For example, targeting these groups to increase their knowledge about responsible dog ownership. So we had an understanding of the attitudes and dog ownership practices in these countries. The next step was therefore to determine the size, dynamics, and health status of dog populations in 2 of our focal countries. We focused on collecting data in 2 locations, in Pescara in Italy and in Lviv in Ukraine. These populations had ongoing dog population management through both catch, neuter, return and sheltering, and there were different levels between our different study sites. So in these 2 study regions, we had 4 study sites. We created survey routes, predetermined survey routes, and we created these routes to cover as much of the area as possible. We always conducted our mark recapture surveys at the same time of day, so between 7 and 9 a.m. And we recorded the information that we collected on the dogs using the Animal ID app. We also took photographs of dogs for individual identification. And we recorded information on the GPS, location of the dog, their sex, their age, and in Lviv, the dogs that had been captured, neutered, and vaccinated were given an ear tag, so we could then determine the neutering and vaccination status of dogs. We also recorded those that were visibly pregnant or lactating and those that had visible skin conditions or injuries, as well as giving them a body condition score. We recorded as well environmental conditions such as temperature, whether it was raining, and if there were any markets on during the survey. So we used a photographic method of marking and capturing the individuals. This means that we used their coat color and their natural markings for identifying the dogs. And you can see here that this dog was identified across 3 different time points, 3 different surveys, and we were able to re-identify that individual. Often those involved in dog population management estimate dog population sizes through closed mark recapture methods, such as the Lincoln-Peterson method. These closed mark recapture methods only include one sampling occasion with surveys over consecutive days. And this provides an estimate of the dog population size and also the detection probability. So this is where if a dog is in the study area, the detection probability is the probability that you will observe that dog. So these closed mark recapture surveys can be repeated several times, and the results can be compared to see whether the population is increasing or decreasing. But this method assumes that during the time that the mark recapture is taking place, that the population is closed both geographically and demographically. So that means that there's no births, deaths, or migration. But we were interested in estimating these rates, estimating the rates of recruitment and removal. So we therefore carried out the Pollock's robust design mark recapture method. And this involves widely spaced primary sampling periods between which we assume that the population is open to the influences of recruitment and removal. And we also have closely spaced secondary sampling periods where we assume that the population is closed to these influences. So this method, it uses a combination of closed and open mark recapture. And this allows us to provide more robust estimates of recruitment and removal, giving us important information about how that dog population is changing. We carried out this survey over 15 months between April 2018 and July 2019. And we had 5 primary sampling occasions. So we conducted these surveys every 3 months. Apart from between October and April, we missed the survey in January, and this was because of the extremely cold weather conditions during this time that made traveling to these countries logistically challenging. We then carried out in each of these sampling occasions 3 consecutive secondary sampling occasions. So we carried out surveys over 3 consecutive days. And during this time, we assume that the population is close to the influences of recruitment and removal. So during this survey, we identified 53 unique individuals in Pescara in Italy, and 182 individuals in Ukraine. We found that the average dog density in Pescara was much lower than in Lviv in Ukraine, but we found that there was a skew towards a higher percentage of males, and this is something that is reported quite often in free-roaming dog populations. Interestingly, we found that most of the dogs that we observed were adults. We observed very few juvenile dogs in our surveys. And we observed no pregnant females and very few lactating females. We also found that the prevalence of skin conditions and the prevalence of visible injuries was quite low, and that dogs in these locations had most often a normal body condition or above normal body condition. In Lviv, we were able to determine their neutering and vaccination coverage, and we found that between the study sites, this varied between 17 and 52%. So this is telling us that using the methods and the measures that we took, the dogs were in fairly good health and welfare in these locations. So moving on to the recruitment and removal rates, we found, well, first looking at the detection probability, so that probability of observing a dog, We found that this was slightly higher in Pescara in Italy compared to in Ukraine. And just a reminder, this is the probability that if a dog is in the study site, that it will be detected. In our study, we estimated the average monthly recruitment rate, and we estimated this was between 9 to 20% of the population per month is recruited in Pescara in Italy, and between 12 and 24% in between the different study sites in Lviv. Just a reminder that recruitment rate includes the births, immigration, and abandonment of dogs. Whereas removal rate, we found that the monthly removal rate was around 7% of the population in both Pescara in Italy and Lviv in Ukraine. And recruitment and removal rate is the deaths, emigration, and the adoption of dogs in these populations. So these findings show that we had fairly high recruitment rates and fairly high removal rates, and this has important consequences for both population and disease control, particularly in Lviv in Ukraine. In Ukraine, rabies is a public health concern, and there are periodic outbreaks of rabies in the free-roaming dog populations. We recorded vaccination and neutering coverage of between 17 to 52%, and this is below the 70% vaccination coverage that is required to prevent an outbreak of rabies. And with a higher recruitment and removal rate, this can reduce both the vaccination and the neutering coverage even further. So it is difficult to disentangle these different processes of recruitment and removal. With the removal rates, the lifespan of free-roaming dogs is low. It's often about 3 years. The lifespan of dogs is often about 3 years in parts of Africa and Asia, and this translates to a death rate of about 3% per month. Because of this, this suggests that a lot of the removal rate of the population is occurring by emigration and adoption. Similarly, with the recruitment rate, it's challenging to disentangle whether recruitment is occurring through births, immigration, and abandonment. But we had very few juveniles in our study, so this might indicate that recruitment instead is happening through immigration and abandonment. This has important implications for population control. This suggests that we should focus our efforts to reduce abandonment and also to ensure that any management covers the entire city so that dogs don't move from other areas into the area where population management is taking place. So we looked for statistical associations between some environmental factors and detection probability and removal probability. We found that there were no significant effects of rain, the sex of the dog, the study site, or the primary period on detection probability. But we did find that detection probability was lower on weekdays compared to weekends, and it was higher on days where there was a market on compared to days when there was no market on. This has implications for how mark recapture surveys should be conducted. This means that surveys should try and control for day of the week, either statistically or through the study design, and also take into account the human activity and behavior, such as markets that are occurring that might influence the detection probability. We also found that there were no significant effects of study site or primary periods on the removal probability, but we did find that removal probability was much higher for male dogs. Lots of other studies report that females have a higher mortality rate. So this suggests that possibly the higher removal rate is because of increased movement of male dogs. And we couldn't look for any associations with recruitment probability because of the statistical and analytical methods that were used. The main take-home messages from this part of the study were therefore that the high recruitment and removal rates have implications for population and disease control, and also that the mark recapture survey should try and control for these effects that we found on detection probability. So moving towards the systems model now, we used the key findings from the questionnaire and the mark recapture study to fit into a systems model to assess the impacts of dog population management. In our model, we split up the dog population into 3 different subpopulations. So we had street dogs, which were the free-roaming owned and unowned dogs. We had the owned dogs, which were restricted and owned, and we had sheltered dogs. These were dogs that were restricted and unowned. And to build up our systems model, we included the flows that increased or decreased these population sizes. So these different subpopulations change in size by individuals flowing between the different subpopulations and also through births and deaths, which were intrinsically modeled. And they also could change by dogs being acquired by breeders or friends or from other neighborhoods, and this was extrinsically modeled. When assessing the impact of dog population management, it's important that we consider these rates of movement between the different dog subpopulations, because these populations are interactive and dynamic. A dog can move between the different subpopulations through time. So for example, a dog could be part of the street dog population. It could then be taken into a shelter and become part of the shelter dog population, where it might be adopted and moved into the own dog population. And then again, it might unfortunately be abandoned and moved back into the street dog population. And as we have mentioned before, the different dog population management methods can alter these different rates that increase or decrease the different dog subpopulations. So catch, neuter, return reduces the birth rate. Culling increases the death rate of street dogs. Sheltering increases the movement into the shelter dog population. And responsible dog ownership interventions, they depend on the method that's being used, but they can aim to reduce the amount of abandonment taking place and increase the amount of adoption from shelters. So the systems dynamics model is described by ordinary differential equations. And these equations are simply explaining what is happening in the previous conceptual map, but in mathematical terminology. So each of the equations describes how each of the different subpopulations is increasing or decreasing. We simulated 6 intervention scenarios. So we simulated the culling of dogs, sheltering, responsible dog ownership, and in our model, responsible dog ownership was the reduction in the abandonment of owned dogs and an increase in the rehoming of dogs from shelters. We also simulated catch, neuter, return, and because dog population management in reality often involves combinations of methods, we modeled combined catch, neuter, return and sheltering, and combined catch, neuter, return and responsible ownership. So to simulate these different intervention scenarios, we simply alter the equations or we alter the parameters that simulate what is happening during each of the interventions. We were also interested in exploring different interventions under different scenarios. We wanted to know what happened when we applied the interventions continuously or annually. So this is where dogs are culled, sheltered, or neutered every month, or if they are culled, sheltered, or neutered in one event per year. And we wanted to explore the impact of the interventions when they were applied for the full duration of the simulation, and also when they were applied for a single period of control. So in this case, we looked at a 5-year period of control followed by no further intervention. We also looked at the different interventions when they were applied at different intervention coverages, so low, medium, and high coverages. And this referred to the percentage of the population that were culled, neutered, or sheltered, or the percentage of the population that were adopted, or the percentage decrease in abandonment. And to inform the parameters in our model, we used either the data that we had collected in the previous work or data from the literature. So when we ran our different interventions and our different scenarios, this graph overall summarizes the results. When we zoom in to look at the different intervention coverages, it's quite clear to see that with higher intervention coverages, the impact on reducing dog population size was greater, regardless of the method that was being used. So with greater coverage of management, there's a greater reduction in the dog population size, which is unsurprising. With the annual versus continuous control, on average, the different interventions, when they were applied at the same level of coverage, had similar effects. But with interventions where dogs were removed from the population, such as culling or sheltering, we saw fluctuations in the dog population size between the different intervention events. So this is what you can see in the green or the gold color here. The population rises between the annual interventions. When we look at the impact of the different interventions, we'll take one scenario here as an example. So this is the continuously applied high coverage intervention when it's applied for the full duration of the simulation. And we can see that responsible ownership and catch-neuter return, when applied alone, were least effective at reducing the free-roaming dog population size. Combined, sheltering and catch-neuter return was slightly more effective, and sheltering and culling had similar levels of effectiveness. But the most effective overall was combined responsible dog ownership and catch-neuter return. This is interesting because when applied alone, catch-neuter return and responsible ownership were least effective. We observed a synergistic effect when they were applied in combination. And this is likely because the methods target multiple sources of population increase through births, but also through the abandonment of owned dogs. Now, when we look at interventions when they were applied for that single 5-year period of control, we see a slightly different situation. Culling and sheltering were the most effective, but responsible ownership combined with catch-neuter return was only slightly less effective. But those methods that did not include neutering returned more quickly back up to this equilibrium level than those that did include neutering. So this equilibrium level is the size of the free-roaming dog population when there is no management taking place. So this means that the key take-home messages are that the methods that target multiple sources of population increase, such as the combined catch-neuter return and responsible ownership, were more effective in the long term. The interventions that included neutering maintained that street dog population at a lower size for longer in short-term interventions. But we also want to highlight the importance of identifying the potential sources of population increase so that we can ensure the long-term impact of dog population management. If these sources, such as immigration from owned dog populations or from neighbouring communities, are not targeted, the effects of any method of management might be dampened. And This research has been is currently under review, but if you're interested in looking at it, it is available as a preprint. So we had created this systems model, and we wanted to then create a user interface that allows the user to play around with the systems model using local dog population parameters. But because assessing the effectiveness of dog population management requires that you know how many dogs there are in a population, we also included a section that allows the user to estimate their local dog population size using two types of mark recapture methods. So we allow the user to estimate the dog population size using the Lincoln-Peterson method by simply putting in the number of dogs observed and reobserved. And also we allow the user to input a file of closed mark recapture surveys, and they can estimate dog population size using the closed mark recapture method through RMark. The user can then use this information to estimate the size, use this information of dog population size estimates and also local parameters, and they can input this into the systems model and play around with different interventions. They can apply the different interventions at different periodicities, so continuous or annual, and different coverages of control to see what the predicted impact would be of their dog population management. And we hope that this can be used as a predictive tool to help inform organisations about the resources required for dog population management. This is an ongoing project. It is, if you're interested to have a look at it, you can use the QR code to go to the current systems, the current RShiny app, if you want to play around with the model. And there's also a link in there for all of the modeling code. It's available on GitHub. So this was my PhD project, and this project was a collaboration between the University of Leeds, my supervisors, Professor Lisa Collins and Dr. Rupert Quinnell, and postdoctoral researcher Dr. Connor Gould. This research was funded by Veerfoten International, or Fourpaws International, and we also collaborated with the Italian Institute of Animal Health in Abruzzo and Molise, as well as collaborating with Animal ID to help us collect our data, and also the Humane Society International. So thank you very much for listening.
Muchas gracias, Lauren. Laura, ¿sigo yo o...? Ok, sigo yo. Laura, Lauren, may you close your presentation, please? ¿Puedes cerrar la presentación?
Mm-hmm.
Sí, nos dicen si pudieras compartir nuevamente el código QR, ya que sale inválido. No sé.
Ah.
Quizás.
It's invalid.
O quizás.
I can provide an updated version.
Ok, gracias. O una dirección de URL puede ser. Tenemos 3 preguntas.
Shall I stop sharing my screen?
Ok, mejor. Sí, gracias. Tenemos 3 preguntas. Y después vamos a dar las preguntas que alguien quiera hacer nuevamente. Alexandra pregunta si tú pudieras compartir de a dónde se obtuvo esta información de que hay entre 700.000 700 millones y 1 billón de perros y un estimado de 75% son free range dogs.
Yeah, so I think 700 million to 1 billion, that comes from two references. I think it is Hughes and I've forgotten the name of the other one, but I can provide that reference for everyone.
Matthew Gomper.
Yes, that's it. Yes, that's the one.
Un libro que publicaron recientemente. Ok. Andrea Lucero, quizás algunos no me escuchan, quizás porque están con la traducción, sí, o sea, quizás ponerse en español o la original. De acuerdo a los resultados obtenidos, si los planes de control debieran enfocarse más en el manejo de la reproducción en machos que en hembras. ¿Qué opinas tú?
I think that is a really interesting question, and it's not something that we investigated in our systems model, but it would be possible to answer that question by simply splitting up the model into males and females. I know that many organizations focus on neutering females, and this is often done in population management. If a organization has limited resources, it makes more sense to focus on the females with those resources, because focusing on males and females, you'd have a lower overall coverage. But it's not something that we answered in our research.
Ok, muchas gracias. María Agle pregunta si en las encuestas, en los cuestionarios, plantearon las causas del abandono, si saben cuáles fueron las causas principales de abandono de los animales.
We did. So we found that we gave them up. The most often they answered that it was because of behavioral problems, but they also answered that it might be because they were moving home or they had work commitments, and that is why they abandoned the dogs. So most of the answers were not one of the options that we provided. They were an other option, and the respondent provided the free text. But of the answers that we provided, they answered that it was because of animal behavioral problems.
Ok, muchas gracias. Alexandra pregunta nuevamente. Sí, necesita, o sea, si pudiera ella tener acceso al trabajo en preprint, y si no, si se puede compartir ahora o enviar una dirección de email.
Yeah, I can.
Creo que lo puedes poner en el chat.
In the chat.
In the chat, yeah. Mientras tanto, ahí está Lauren. Pregunta Karina si se habla actualmente que el método de CNR, que es esterilización y liberación, no es un método seguro debido a que los perros regresan a las calles, defienden su territorio y pueden ser todavía un riesgo en la salud pública en cuanto a las mordeduras. ¿Qué opinión tiene?
That's very true. I know that with catch, neuter, return, it isn't always the most feasible solution. It doesn't stop dogs that bite people, but it also doesn't stop those dogs that are predating on wildlife or livestock. So returning them back to the location that they are found is not always the best solution. In Italy, they have an interesting system. Dogs that are taken into the what they call the local health units. They are assessed, and if the dog is not suitable to go back out to the street, they are then taken to a shelter. But if they seem to be a healthy and happy dog, they're put back out onto the street. Interestingly, with the bite injuries, we often see reported in literature that dogs that are more often, the dogs that are likely to bite people are dogs that are owned. We're more likely to be bitten by our owned dogs than by dogs on the street. So that is definitely a concern, and it's understandable that the public might not want those dogs to be put out to the street because they might be seen as a health concern in that way, or also a concern to cause traffic accidents as well.
Ok, muchas gracias. Voy a leer ahora algunas preguntas que están en el chat, pero si ustedes se fijan a la derecha dice pregunta y respuesta. Ahí, porque si no se me van perdiendo las preguntas. La pregunta es si la tenencia responsable de mascota, si es más caro tener un animal, esto hace que aumente ¿cómo es? Más costosa la tenencia de perros, disminuirá la población. ¿Qué opinamos? Yo voy a reformular la pregunta. Si que sea más caro tener perros, ¿incrementa la liberación de animales hacia las calles? Creo que por ahí va la cosa.
Like because of health problems or something like that, the cost to keep a dog. I think that can relate to reasons why people would abandon a dog, and I think that does happen. That happens in the UK as well, especially for breeds that have more medical requirements. So it definitely can feed into why people abandon dogs. Interestingly, slightly not related, but we found in our research that those who did not neuter a dog, they did not report very often this was because of cost reasons, which is interesting in these countries because there's quite a push for low cost neutering. And it might be that they have access to low cost neutering, and this means that that's not the main reason that they are not neutering their dogs.
Ok, muchas gracias. Diego levantó la mano. Diego. Voy a hacerla en español y después la traducen. Diego Procopio, ¿sí?
Hola, no sé si se escucha.
Sí, se escucha.
Ah, perdón. Fue un error, pero igual la voy a repreguntar. Uno de los aspectos para limitar la población, o sea, los recursos comunes, ¿sí? O tener limitaciones en los recursos comunes, como, no sé, el acceso a la vía pública, es, o otros recursos, por ejemplo, en la pesca, a ver, limitar la actividad para que no sea tan extractiva, es hacerla cada vez más cara. Entonces la pregunta iba apuntada a eso, ¿sí? Que sería interesante en realidad más que una pregunta, tratar de evaluar el costo de la tenencia de perros y cómo afectaría eso en el tamaño de la población, ¿no? Si un municipio está dispuesto a hacer cada vez más caro la tenencia de perros y eso en cuánto influenciaría en el manejo. Ahí va, perdón.
So like the cost of buying a dog, or the cost of
taxes, something like that.
Taxes. Yeah. So I think that is a method that is used to try and encourage responsible dog ownership. We did look at that in our questionnaire survey, whether respondents had paid for their dog. And I can't remember if we found any associations between whether someone had paid for a dog and if they were abandoned. But I think that it is a valid method to try and reduce the risk that someone would abandon their dog.
Acá hay otra pregunta, gracias Lauren, de Ricardo, que estaba en tu presentación, pero pregunta, ¿cuál sería la solución según lo que encontraron? Hay varias opciones en realidad, pero para disminuir el número de animales callejeros, según los modelos que ustedes encontraron, ¿cuál sería la mejor solución para reducir los free roaming dogs?
So I think it will vary between different countries. I think one of the main things that we need to understand is what are the sources that are increasing that dog population. In some locations, it may be that there is a very particularly high birth rate, and in those locations, it may be more suitable for catch, neuter, return. From the information that we had and from the parameters that we used, we found that methods that reduce the birth rate of dogs, but also reduce the amount of dogs that were abandoned, were most effective overall. And so this is quite difficult. It's not an easy solution to reduce the amount of dogs that are abandoned. It's something that requires human behavior change. But that is, from what our results, what we found to be the most effective solution over long periods of time.
Muchas gracias. A ver, aquí hay otro. Ok, si es que hay alguna estimación de en cuántos años se podrá observar una disminución significativa de la población canina a nivel mundial. Quizá a nivel mundial es muy difícil. En la población que tú estudiaste, o a nivel, la pregunta a nivel mundial, pero ¿cómo lo ves?
I think from the results and from other modeling studies, if you're using methods that include neutering, it can take several years for that population to decrease. And this is because when you do catch, neuter, return, you return that dog back to the population. And so it remains part of that population size. So with methods that include neutering, they might take longer for the population to reduce in a matter of years. But we found that methods that did include neutering, the population stayed at a lower size for longer. Methods where dogs were removed from the population, such as through culling or through sheltering, reduce the population size much more quickly. And this makes sense because we're taking those dogs out of the population. But it's important to note that we, in this model, were able to perfectly simulate that dogs could be caught and taken out of the population or caught and neutered, whereas in reality, it can be quite challenging. We think it can be quite challenging to achieve these coverages that we were modeling. And often it's quite challenging for organizations that are carrying out these methods. It's quite challenging for them to first estimate how many dogs there are and for them to really understand what coverage they're able to achieve in terms of population management, whether that be culling or neutering. Understandably, it's very challenging to get real life data on the number of dogs that have been culled. This is something that often happens sporadically and in response to, for example, government changes in locations. So that's a kind of long-winded answer there.
Hay una pregunta sobre, pero voy a complementar la pregunta. ¿Y qué porcentaje, cuando ponían el Capture, Neutering, Release, qué porcentaje de esterilización incluyeron en el modelo? Porque alguien pregunta, ¿cuál es el porcentaje de cirugías de control de la natalidad anual que se deben hacer en una población para generar un impacto significativo? La parametrización del modelo, que ustedes hicieron un análisis de sensibilidad, pusieron varios porcentajes de esterilización, ¿o qué porcentaje era ese?
We did. So we used, for the high, that was a neutering percentage of 70% of the population.
Okay.
For a medium, I think we used 40% and possibly 20% for the low. But I might need to double check those answers, but these are the kind of levels that we were using.
Ok. Y ese porcentaje era el que producía en combinación con tenencia responsable, producía una reducción importante de la población. Eso es anual, todos los años.
Every year, yes. So we found that responsible ownership and CNR was most effective when it was done every year for the medium and the high coverage, but we didn't find that for the low coverage.
Yo tengo una pregunta respecto a la tenencia responsable, promover la tenencia responsable. ¿Cómo lo hicieron? Porque todos los otros parámetros son anuales. ¿Cómo afecta la tenencia responsable al corto plazo? Porque eso me imagino que es más a largo plazo. Y todos tus otros parámetros son anuales. ¿Cómo tú te aseguras que la tenencia tiene un efecto en liberar animales al ambiente, a la calle? ¿Cómo es que ese efecto no sea inmediato? Porque quizás tan desfasada la tenencia, tiene que empezar mucho tiempo atrás para que tenga un efecto parta en el año -5 para tener un efecto en el 0. ¿Sí?
Yes, that is a very good point. We assumed in this model that we were able to apply this perfect responsible ownership campaign that immediately reduced abandonment and immediately reduced the number of dogs that were adopted from the shelter. But in reality, that is not really feasible. And we often investigate the impact we talk about investigating the impact of catch, neuter, return, culling and sheltering, but it's very hard to quantify responsible dog ownership interventions and also to understand how much abandonment is taking place in the first place. We obviously asked people in our questionnaire if they had ever given up a dog, but we find in other surveys that people quite often will tell you that they know someone that has given up a dog, but they don't say that they themselves have given up a dog. So it's hard for us to quantify the amount of abandonment that's taking place. And therefore, it's hard for us to understand the impact of responsible dog ownership interventions because it's just very challenging to understand these figures. And that's a very good point that the responsible dog ownership interventions, they're not likely to have an immediate effect. Because we're talking about changing human behavior, this is something that is likely to take a bit of time.
Muchas gracias. Como alguien lo preguntó, ¿qué opinas de los caniles municipales, de los caniles para tener perros que se van recuperando y se van manteniendo en ese lugar para adopción? Creo que eso es, ¿no?
Can you say that again?
¿Cuál es tu opinión sobre los shelter, municipal shelters, from local government shelters that are in place. Here in Chile, almost they are not.
I missed very faintly. I missed the last bit there.
Si es alguien que preguntó eso, si es que los caniles municipales, Consuelo, si me puedes ayudar, ¿cuál es tu opinión, tu pregunta sobre si los caniles tienen un efecto en el control de las poblaciones?
So the city, the municipality shelters were quite different in Ukraine and in Italy. In Italy, every region has to have a public veterinary health unit. And that is where all the dogs are sent before they go to shelters. And there are some regions that have private shelters, and there are some regions that have government-funded municipality shelters. And from my experience, from what I have seen, there's very different levels of shelters. In terms of the animals that are living there, some of these shelters did not provide really high welfare or good environments for these dogs. Some of them were very effective when they did take a dog from the street and they advertised them. Some of these shelters were very good at rehoming the dogs. We saw a very good municipality shelter in Lviv that had a high rehoming rate. It had a rehoming rate of about 50% of the population of the shelter per year, I think 40 to 50%. And they had an interesting structure. They took dogs in from the street, they neutered them. They had an animal behaviorist who would train the dogs, and they would keep the dog in the shelter for 2 weeks. And they would put a lot of effort into advertising the dogs to try and get them to be rehomed. And if they weren't rehomed within those 2 weeks, they put them back out onto the street. So it was an interesting strategy that I hadn't seen in other places. So kind of my answer is the effectiveness of the city shelters very much varied across the different locations. I also saw shelters in near Kyiv in Ukraine that had 3,000 dogs and very rarely were able to rehome dogs. So I think the success of these shelters is very different across different countries, but also within different countries as well.
Muchas gracias. Nos quedan muy pocos minutos y hay una pregunta que quedó acá. ¿Ustedes evaluaron o vieron si en los países había fiscalización sobre tenencia responsable o no se observaba fiscalización? En Italia, Ucrania y en Bulgaria.
Not in Ukraine and not really in Bulgaria. They had legislation to try and enforce responsible ownership practices, such as ensuring that an owned dog is kept in its home and that it doesn't breed, either by neutering the dog or ensuring that it doesn't contact any intact males or females. But that legislation did not, from what I heard, it didn't seem to be enforced in Bulgaria. In Ukraine, similarly, the enforcement of legislation to encourage responsible ownership seemed to be low as well. Things seemed to be slightly better in Italy, but in general, it didn't seem that enforcement of responsible ownership was very high across these different countries. When you compare to, for example, in the UK, we very rarely see dogs on the street. And if a dog is seen on the street, it is very quickly picked up by the dog warden, and it's taken to a shelter. These dogs are all microchipped and mostly microchipped and are given back to owners. Dogs are microchipped in Italy and in Bulgaria and Ukraine, but particularly in Bulgaria and Ukraine, the number of dogs that are microchipped can be quite low. And so there are lots of charities that try and encourage microchipping as well of these dogs.
Muchas gracias. Y una última pregunta, que pregunta Diego, que yo entiendo que no, es si el modelo incluye un análisis económico, me imagino, sobre qué costos tendría alcanzar la reducción poblacional con, no sé, un 70% de neutering, de esterilización y todos los otros factores. ¿Eso no se incluyó en este modelo?
Yeah, we did. So I didn't talk through those results, but we also included a kind of cost analysis, and we also used quite a basic welfare scoring system as well. So in terms of the cost analysis, it's quite different to encompass this into the model, to encompass all aspects of cost, because the different methods, for example, responsible ownership, it's unclear how much advertising, how much money is needed to encourage owners to be more responsible. So what we did was we looked at the staff time that was required for each of these different interventions. So we used data from our collaborators to understand how long a staff member, how many dogs could be neutered in a day, and how many staff members were needed to care for those dogs, and also how many staff members were needed to care for dogs in shelters. And also we understood how many dog catchers they needed to catch these dogs. So we were able to compare staff hours, and we found that sheltering was the most costly because dogs are taken into the shelter, and if we don't increase the rehoming rate, then that shelter population just increases and increases. In our model, we did not, dogs were not killed in the shelter. They remained there until they naturally died or were rehomed. And that allowed us to estimate these costs of an increasing shelter population. We found that catch, neuter, return and responsible ownership, because it reduced the street dog population so much, but didn't increase the shelter dog population, we found that that was the most cost-effective method, and it also had the highest levels of welfare as well. So that's all detailed in the preprint if anyone is interested in going into that in detail.
Muchísimas gracias, un gusto, Lauren, y los dejo con Laura. Está silenciada, Laura.
Perdón por eso. Gracias, Lauren, por tu presentación. Excelente presentación, muy interesante. Y Gerardo, también gracias por liderar la sesión de preguntas y respuestas. Bueno, no queda más que dar las gracias por la participación de todos y por todas las preguntas interesantes que hicieron. También dar las gracias a Lauren por su excelente presentación y darse el tiempo también de hacerlo. Dar las gracias también, obviamente, a Andrea Cayosi, que hizo un excelente trabajo en la traducción. Sin ella no habría sido posible, obviamente. También dar gracias a Grisel Navarro y Paula Ramírez nuevamente por hacer las gestiones y prestarnos la cuenta de Zoom. Dar las gracias a Denise, que nos ha estado ayudando desde atrás. Dar gracias también obviamente a Colmevet, a la Consejería de Ñuble, a la Consejería de La Araucanía, a la Comisión de Bienestar Animal y de Tenencia Responsable, y también dar las gracias a la Universidad Austral de Chile y a la Universidad Católica de Temuco. Lamentablemente no tenemos más tiempo para discutir sobre este tema. Entiendo que para todos esto es un tema que tenemos muy cercano a nuestro corazón, y de seguro hay muchas preguntas que quedaron volando. Por eso mismo, preguntas que quedaron sin responder. Por eso mismo acá les voy a compartir el Twitter de Lauren y su correo, por si tienen alguna pregunta lo pueden contactar. Y con eso me despido y les doy nuevamente las gracias y un muy caluroso abrazo para todos y que tengan un muy buen día.
Chao, chao.
Chao, que estén bien.
Cuídense.